They say the Imperium of man is eternal, unbreakable, and unyielding beneath the shadow of the Emperor's golden throne. Billions live and die with his name carved into their lips, their devotion measured not in days but in sacrifices that stretch across millennia. Yet even in a galaxy where loyalty is the sole coin of survival, there are whispers of another truth. For those who falter, for those who dare to turn their eyes from the Aquila and betray the Imperium, there is no redemption, only ruin. To betray the Emperor is not merely to abandon faith, it is to forfeit one's name, one's bloodline, and even the possibility of memory. Entire worlds have been scoured clean for a single act of treachery, families erased, regiments shattered, histories rewritten until nothing remains but ash in the void. But what does betrayal look like in a galaxy where obedience is demanded in every breath? And what truly is the cost when the Imperium decides that betrayal has taken root? This is not the story of heroes nor martyrs. It is the shadow cast by loyalty itself, and the abyss that waits for those who dare to fall. Before we descend into the silence of forgotten names, join us on this journey into the depths of Imperial wrath. Lend your strength to this chronicle by subscribing, leaving your mark with a like, and sharing it with those who walk the same dark paths of curiosity. Your voice here among us ensures the tale endures, for even whispers must be carried, lest they be lost to the void. The vox crackled with static, the sound like dry bones grinding in the dust, and the boy flinched. He stood in line with 100 others, lasgun clutched against his chest, its weight both anchor and chain. The drill square was nothing more than cracked ferrocrete, stained dark where executions had burned themselves into the stone. Above him loomed Commissar Havel, a grim figure encased in a long black coat, the brass of his vox grill glinting in the ashen daylight. Every syllable that escaped that grill was a decree, heavy as iron, impossible to ignore. The Emperor watches. The Emperor weighs. The Emperor judges. The words were ritual, but to the boy they rang hollow. His lips shaped the response in time with the others, but inside his chest, faith trembled like a candle guttering in a draft. The smell of promethium drifted even here, carried on the choking wind from the manufactorum spires. Great columns of smoke bled into the horizon, a permanent dusk. The boy's stomach twisted with hunger, but not from nerves alone. Rations had been cut again. Word had spread that the grain silos were nearly empty, that the governor had locked them away for the tithe. He tried to push the thought down, to swallow it like a bitter seed, but whispers carried faster than sermons. A name faltered in his throat, the Emperor's name, meant to be shouted as oath and comfort. But when he spoke it, it felt heavier than salvation. Far from the drill square, the manufactorum choked with labor. Overseers barked through rebreather masks as sparks cascaded from half-broken machines. Men and women moved like shadows, their hands raw, their lungs thick with ash. They rationed grain amongst themselves, their portions measured by survival rather than loyalty. A mother broke her crust in half for her child, hiding it beneath an oily rag so the overseer would not see. The act was not rebellion, it was desperation. Yet in the ledger of the Imperium, such desperation was indistinguishable from treachery. The scribe felt it most keenly. His chamber was a narrow alcove lit by a single lumen that flickered as though resisting the darkness. His fingers, ink-stained and trembling, hovered above a data slate. He had altered the numbers again. Just a line, a mark, a flicker of falsehood that shifted rations away from the governor's stores to the hab blocks where his kin starved. The quill rasped against the slate like a guilty whisper. He paused, the words of the daily sermon echoing in his skull. Every lie is a blade to the Emperor's back. He closed his eyes, inhaling the thick incense that drifted in from the adjoining chapel, and asked himself whether the Emperor would damn him for saving his family or for letting them die. And so the city hummed with contradictions, 1,000 quiet acts hidden beneath hymns and the thunder of industry. Each gesture was small, almost invisible, drowned beneath the roar of devotion and decree. Yet every act carried weight. The voxcasters repeated the creed without end, their static-choked chants seeping into every corner of the hive. But beneath it one could almost hear another rhythm, softer, dangerous, a whisper beneath the roar. The boy felt it most when the commissar's gaze settled on him. His breath caught as the vox grill descended, the man's presence heavy as a storm front. He knew what that stare meant. Hesitation was heresy. Fear was heresy. Hunger itself could be painted as heresy if it drew the soldier's mind from service. His knees wavered, his grip on the lasgun slipping as sweat stung his palms. The others around him stood rigid, their eyes glazed with the practiced fervor of men who had learned that survival depended on appearing unbreakable. He wanted to join them, to drown his trembling in the chorus. But the Emperor's name curdled on his tongue, sour as spoiled bread. The Commissar spoke again, voice a grinding thunder through the grill. The Emperor demands obedience. The Emperor does not forgive weakness. The boy's heart slammed against his ribs, each beat a hammer strike. He lifted his chin, met that gaze, and in that instant all the contradictions of his world pressed in, the hunger of his belly, the smoke of the manufactorum, the quiet defiance of a scribe's quill, the whispered ration shared between mother and child. Survival, he realized, was the truest act of rebellion, and yet survival was the only prayer he could still believe in. A silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The Commissar's hand lingered near the bolt pistol at his side, the polished Aquila gleaming faintly in the dying light. The boy's throat tightened, words trapped between confession and oath, between life and execution. Time seemed to hang there, suspended, the static of the vox filling every breath like a chorus of ghosts. And then the world narrowed to that single moment. The boy's gaze locked with the Commissar's. Obedience and damnation balanced on the edge of a blade. The silence was no longer empty. It roared. The Aquila was everywhere, stamped into the rusted steel of hab-block walls, painted across banners that sagged in the damp air, carved even into the stone tiles of the shrine steps where generations had knelt until their knees bled. To a child, it was supposed to be a symbol of majesty, of the Emperor's gaze stretched wide across the galaxy, wings unfurled in eternal protection. But in the hive, beneath the smog-choked sky and the weight of hunger that pressed bones against skin, the double-headed eagle had become something else entirely. Each time a citizen's eyes fell upon it, the message was not one of salvation, but of debt, endless unpayable debt. The Aquila did not give. It only demanded. In the narrow arteries of the hive city, the faithful shuffled toward the shrines of the ecclesiarchy. Their robes were threadbare, the hem soaked with the grime of the streets, their faces pale and hollow from too many days spent on rations thinner than dust. The air was thick with incense, bitter and choking, but behind its perfumed veil lay the stench of bodies pressed too close, of sweat unwashed, of hunger carried like a second skin. Each pilgrim clutched some offering in hand, scraps of bread, a chipped cog, even a smear of machine oil, tokens so pitiful it hurt to watch them lay these things down before marble icons and vox altars that demanded obedience more than reverence. The Arbits stood guard at every street corner, their visors black, their shock malls humming faintly with the promise of violence. It was not devotion they sought, but performance. One hesitation, one lip that failed to move in sync with the sermon, one eye that dared to linger on the ground instead of the Aquila, and the punishment would be swift, public, and absolute. The overseer of Manufactorum 17 felt the pressure most keenly. His lungs were lined with promethium ash, his hands scarred from decades of grinding labor. Yet still he bent his knee before the eagle at every dawn shift. His voice was cracked when he mouthed the daily prayer, the words no longer carrying weight in his heart, only in the necessity of survival. In his office he measured grain by handfuls, his scales always one notch heavier for the workers he trusted most, lighter for those who had already lost too much to starvation to notice the theft. He whispered apologies into the air as he did so, half prayers, half pleas, begging the Emperor's forgiveness even as he doubted whether the master of mankind could hear him through the smoke and the static of the Astronomicon. And in a dim archive cell, the scribe moved with shaking hands over his data slate. He pressed the seal of the Imperium against the altered numbers, his thumb lingering on the wax like a brand of guilt. He heard the litanies from the shrine below, the booming chant of the ecclesiarchy carried by voxcasters, and tried to believe they still meant something. But when his stylus scratched out a false number, hiding a diverted ration, hiding a stolen day of life for his kin, the words above felt hollow. He told himself it was only a small lie, only one record among millions. But in the Imperium, every mark was a covenant, and breaking it meant blasphemy as surely as spitting on the Aquila itself. Everywhere the weight pressed down. In the hab-block stairwells, Aquila stenciled in faded paint watched with lifeless eyes. In the corridors of the administratum, they glared from parchment seals that bound citizens to servitude in ink and blood. Even in the air itself, the voxhorns spat endless praise, their static-choked voices weaving sermons into every heartbeat. And yet beneath that roar of ritual something else festered. Not open rebellion, the Arbits and Commissars saw to that, but a deeper weariness, a hollowing of the soul that turned prayer into habit and loyalty into disguise. The people bowed their heads, but their eyes were empty. They lifted their hands in reverence, but their fingers shook with fatigue. Faith itself was becoming brittle, fragile as bone under strain. The fracture widened in silence, hidden in plain sight. A mother recited the catechism of the Emperor's mercy, even as she held her child's thin body close, knowing mercy had long since fled these streets. A laborer kissed the aquila carved above his workshop door, then stole an extra ration slip to stay alive another day. Each act was both prayer and betrayal, a paradox written into the marrow of survival. And with every day that passed, the gulf between symbol and substance grew wider, the aquila itself becoming a reminder not of hope, but of the crushing truth that nothing would ever be enough. Then, as if the hive itself were listening, the vox horns blared with a tone unlike the usual chants. It was sharp, urgent, the kind of sound that cut through conversation and prayer alike. A mechanized voice followed, its syllables drawn long, each word echoing off the ferrocrete walls. By decree of the Holy Ordos, this hive has been selected for inquisitorial audit. The overseer froze mid-breath. The scribe dropped his stylus. The mother's hand stilled over her child's brow. The Arbites did not move, but the weight of their silence deepened. For every whisper, every altered number, every faltering prayer, the meaning was now transformed. What had been quiet, survivable acts of desperation became in an instant death sentences waiting to be uncovered. The vox died back into static, leaving only the echo of that word, audit, hanging in the air like a blade suspended above every neck. And in the suffocating silence that followed, the people stared at the aquila once more, its wings outstretched, demanding. The rumors came first, coiling through the hive spire like smoke from a hidden fire, whispers that men in black robes had been seen at the gates of the ecclesiarchy plaza. Their steps measured, their eyes shrouded beneath hoods, their rosettes catching the light like shards of steel. No one dared speak the word openly, yet it spread from mouth to mouth, thin and trembling. Inquisition. The name alone was enough to sour the air. Not a regiment, not a company, but something far more suffocating. The Inquisition never needed armies to conquer. It came with silence, with questions, with the sudden vanishing of neighbors in the night. The Voxhorns did not announce their presence directly. Instead, the signs appeared in subtler forms. The quiet closing of administratum archives, the locking of shrine doors long before curfew, Arbit's patrols shifting their routes with a precision that betrayed foreknowledge. In the prayer halls, boots echoed against marble tiles, not in cadence but in hunting rhythm. The sound of it was more terrifying than 1,000 laser guns discharging at once. Where those boots fell, silence followed, thick as a shroud. Families gathered closer in their hab blocks, their prayers sharpened, their offerings heavier, as though weight alone could shield them from scrutiny. Yet everyone knew weight was meaningless. The Ordo Hereticus did not measure faith in rations or rituals. They measured it in fractures. The conscript felt that fracture still. He remembered the commissar's gaze, the pause in his prayer, the taste of fear thick on his tongue. Now every step he took across the drill square was haunted by the possibility that someone had seen it, that some unblinking eye had recorded his hesitation. He dreamed of the bolt pistol lifting, of the roar of a shot that never came, and woke with his heart pounding, his throat raw from swallowed screams. Each day he recited the litanies louder, faster, until his voice cracked, desperate to prove what he no longer believed. But the Inquisition did not listen for strength. They listened for the falter, the tremor, the single note out of tune. In Manufactorum 17, the overseer's guilt grew heavier than the ash he coughed up each morning. He thought of the rations he had altered. The grain shifted like a handful of sand against an endless desert. It was nothing, less than nothing, yet it was everything. He imagined the black-robed figures opening his ledgers, tracing their fingers over the numbers, and finding the flaw that glowed like a wound. At his station, he whispered more fervently, pressing his lips to the aquila stenciled above his desk. But even that kiss felt cold, unanswered. The more he prayed, the more hollow the words became. Each syllable carried the weight of suspicion, as though his own voice condemned him. And in the dim archive cell, the scribe no longer heard sermons when they boomed from the vox horns. Instead, he heard judgment. The false numbers he had written seemed to burn through the data slate, marks he could not erase. His fingers shook constantly now, not from hunger but from the certainty that those marks would damn him. He thought of his family, the faces he had tried to protect, and wondered if they too would vanish into the night when the Inquisition's shadow lengthened over his name. He wondered if saving them had only condemned them. The hive itself seemed to hold its breath. Conversations died when Arbites passed. Markets grew quiet as shrines overflowed, people clinging to ritual with the desperation of drowning men clutching driftwood. But the Inquisition was not swayed by the frantic. Their presence was a mirror, and in that mirror, every soul saw the cracks in themselves reflected back with merciless clarity. The hesitation of the conscript, the diversion of the overseer, the falsification of the scribe. None of it mattered how small. None of it could be hidden. In the Imperium, imperfection was heresy, and the Imperium demanded perfection from flesh that could never provide it. When the announcement finally came, it was not shouted but delivered with mechanical calm, the kind of voice that could as easily declare dawn as death. The vox horns crackled, then steadied, carrying the decree through every corridor, every hab cell, every manufactorum chamber. By order of the Ordo Hereticus, all records will be reviewed. The words rang through the hive, a sentence disguised as procedure, a promise that nothing would remain unseen. The scribe froze mid-breath. The overseer's hand slipped on the grain scale, and the conscript bowed his head though no one was watching. The fracture had opened, no longer hidden in whispers but carved into the marrow of every soul who had faltered. Silence would not protect them. Ritual would not protect them. Nothing would, and in the echo of the vox the shadow of the Inquisition deepened, swallowing the last fragile refuge of faith. The boots came first, iron soles striking against ferrocrete with the rhythm of inevitability. Each step of the Adeptus Arbits rolled through the hive spire like thunder in a canyon, echoing down corridors that had known only the shuffle of weary feet. Where those boots landed, silence followed. Then came the arrests. Black-armored figures stormed hab-block doors with shock mauls humming, voxcasters blaring litanies of loyalty that drowned out the screams. The cries of the accused were brief, smothered beneath the amplified roar of sermons proclaiming the Emperor's eternal vigilance. And in those moments, justice was not a word in a tome. It was a weight of iron, of chains, of blood. The arbitrators moved with mechanical precision, their carapace armor polished to a gleam beneath the flickering lanterns of promethium lamps. Their visors were opaque, their faces gone, replaced by the faceless judgment of the Imperium. One raised his shock maul, and a hesitation was extinguished in a flash of crackling energy, the body collapsing in convulsions as the Arbites did not pause to look back. A last round tore into the chest of another kneeling form, the sentence carried out before plea or prayer could be uttered. For the Arbites, the calculus was simple: obedience or erasure. Entire households fell beneath that decree, their only crime a whispered doubt or a faltering hand in the morning prayer. Servitors followed in their wake, massive and mutilated, their mechanical limbs hauling bodies as though they were sacks of grain. Their vox implants murmured scraps of liturgies, even as their hands dragged the condemned into black-shrouded carriers. The air was rank with the mingled scent of blood, ozone, and burning incense wafting through shattered windows. From those same windows, citizens peered through cracks in the ferrocrete shutters, clutching children close, mouthing prayers that felt more like bargains. The hive was a cathedral of judgment, every corridor another nave, every Arbite strike another sermon delivered in fire and chains. Yet beneath the thunder humanity flickered. A child whispered an unanswered prayer into her palms as her father was bound and pulled into the shadows, her voice swallowed by the drone of the vox. A soldier in the Astra Militarum flinched as his lasgun's recoil kicked against his shoulder, his shot striking down a neighbor he had shared rations with only nights before. His eyes lingered on the body, too long enough for another soldier to notice and mark it silently. Even the Arbites themselves betrayed slivers of weariness, their movements unwavering, but their breathing harsh, as though they too were aware of the futility of binding a million fractures with chains. The hive spire groaned under the spectacle. Processions of the ecclesiarchy marched beside the Arbites, swinging censers heavy with incense until the smoke stung eyes and clogged lungs. The sermons issued from vox horns fixed to every wall, urging loyalty, urging obedience, urging silence. Yet the people knew now what silence meant. It was no shield. It was only a pause before the chains came for them. Each family buried its secrets deeper, but not even that felt safe. For the Arbites had ways of peeling back even the most private fractures, neighbors eager to denounce for survival, children repeating words they did not understand, a glance caught by the wrong eyes at the wrong time. The pace of the purges quickened. Arbitrators did not merely strike at whispers now, but at households, entire bloodlines cleansing them from the rolls of the administratum. The message was carved into every act, The Imperium did not tolerate cracks, and to live was to bear the full weight of its judgment without question. Yet the weight was crushing. For how long could hollow eyes recite words that no longer reached their hearts? For how long could a soldier fire without wondering which bullet would finally be turned inward? The culmination came on the drill square, where an Astra Militarum regiment stood under the watchful gaze of Commissar Havel. His black coat hung heavy with dust, his vox grill hissing as it amplified his words to the ranks. Before him knelt 3 men accused of faltering, their heads bowed, their hands bound. The regiment stood silent, laser guns ready, their eyes shifting between the condemned and the commissar. The air was thick with incense, but beneath it, the stench of sweat and fear overpowered all. Havel's hand rose, bolt pistol gleaming in the lantern light. His voice cut through the square, mechanized and merciless. Loyalty proven in blood, or death. The pistol's muzzle leveled at the first kneeling soldier's skull. The regiment's breath froze as one. The trigger clicked, and in that suspended heartbeat, the hive itself seemed to listen, waiting to know whether loyalty would end in a scream or a silence. The commissars did not whisper their authority. They thundered it through the choking air, their voices amplified by vox grills that stripped them of all humanity. If the Adeptus Arbits had been the lash upon the hive's spine, then the commissars were the blade pressed against its throat. I remember the shift in atmosphere, the sudden weight that pressed on every chest when their crimson-caped figures strode into the ranks. Their presence was an accusation, their bolt pistols not symbols but promises. They did not wait for corruption to fester. They cut before the wound could spread. Regiments bled themselves not on foreign battlefields, but in silent plazas where hesitation, doubt, or a flicker of rebellion demanded immediate reaping. Entire squads turned their laser guns inward, compelled by the commissar's gaze, as if loyalty could only be carved into flesh and sealed with death. The manufactorum districts burned first. One night, I heard the shriek of orbital fire tear through the smog-thick sky, followed by the rolling collapse of towers that had stood for centuries. The flames licked upwards like the Emperor's judgment itself, blotting out the stars. They said the strike had come because a single overseer refused a shipment quota. A refusal, nothing more. Yet it was enough to bring death upon tens of thousands who shared his air. The ash drifted across the hive for weeks, coating skin, lungs, and prayer scrolls with the dust of the condemned. There was no refuge from it. Every inhalation was a reminder that obedience was not survival, only a temporary reprieve. The voxnet filled the void that screams alone could not. Chants of loyalty bled into desperate prayers, and desperate prayers dissolved into cries of agony as the commissariat's will pressed harder. The channels were one long hymn of terror and duty, indistinguishable from each other, as if the Imperium itself had decided that emotion was best flattened into a single monotone of fear. And yet beneath that monotone there was always the crackle of fire, the hiss of promethium, the dull thud of bodies collapsing as faith and flesh met their end. Civilians were not spared. They were herded in vast columns through streets lined with banners of the Imperial Aquila, the gold cloth scorched black at the edges by falling embers. The banners seemed to wave not in triumph but in warning, a reminder that to kneel was to survive and to falter was to die. The shrines became furnaces of devotion. Ecclesiarchy priests with censers of thick incense proclaimed that the Emperor's mercy could be found only in ash. And so they gave ash to the people, forcing them to burn their own belongings, their own sacred relics, their own heretical doubts, until smoke choked every chamber and faith was measured by how much a man was willing to see destroyed. Recall the sound of one woman's sobs echoing against the high stone vaults as she cast her child's doll into the flames. The priest praised her obedience, but her body trembled as if she had cast her heart into the fire alongside it. That was the truth of imperial mercy. It took everything, and when you had nothing left, you were called pure. To resist was damnation, to submit was annihilation, and both were the same end, just painted in different liturgies. The awe of it was undeniable. When the shrines glowed like furnaces and the vox horns blared the Emperor's name, there was a terrible beauty in the spectacle. The Imperium was vast, incomprehensible, eternal, and its justice was absolute. But awe curdled into horror when you realized the scale was not to glorify you, but to erase you, to fold you into the great, grinding machine until you were dust indistinguishable from all who had come before. High above, the silhouette of a warship drifted in low orbit, its presence a black crescent that eclipsed even the fires below. Its weapon batteries hummed, armed and waiting, their glow faint but unmistakable. Everyone in the hive knew what it meant. We all stood beneath its shadow, our eyes drawn skyward, our breaths shallow, as if even the air might betray us. Judgment no longer walked in the streets. It loomed in the heavens, silent, patient, and ready. One command, one gesture from a distant hand, and the hive itself could vanish in light. And so, the planet waited. Every prayer, every scream, every whispered plea seemed to rise towards that silent silhouette, as though the fate of millions balanced on the tilt of a single switch. The moment stretched, unbearable, like a blade held just above the throat. The silence after the fires was worse than the screams that had filled them. The manufactorum ruins still smoked, their skeletal frames jutting out of the haze like the bones of giants. But the voices, the cries, the chants, the endless vox hymns had all fallen still, and in that silence the true judgment arrived. It did not march in boots or roar in orbital bombardments. It came in the hush that smothered the hive when the Ordo Hereticus was named. When the word Inquisitor passed between lips, the air itself seemed to recoil, as if sound did not dare linger too long in their shadow. They said an Inquisitor had landed at dawn, though no ship was seen. There were only sudden gaps in the sky lanes, patrols redirected without explanation, and Arbit squads abandoning their checkpoints without argument. Authority itself bent, its spine breaking in unseen hands. Planetary governors, the same men who had ordered executions by the thousands, stood with heads bowed like trembling initiates, their seals and banners meaningless in the presence of a writ signed by Terra. And the commissars, whose bolt pistols had become the final word in loyalty, now stood silent, their discipline not surrender but recognition. They knew that in the Imperium there is power, and then there is the Inquisition. Rumors ran ahead of him like wildfire. Some whispered of exterminatus already petitioned, of orbital cyclonic torpedoes blessed and readied in low orbit. Others swore that the Astronomicon itself had dimmed, as if the Emperor's gaze had shifted to weigh the fate of this single failing world. None of it could be proven, and yet all of it felt true, because truth was irrelevant when fear had already written the ending. The Vox relays crackled with static as the astropaths refused to speak, their minds cowed by dread before the Inquisitor had even entered the chamber. Silence became an answer. Silence became the prayer. And then he walked among us, not with trumpets or banners, but like a shadow given shape, passing through the smoke-thick corridors of the hive spire. His retinue moved first, faceless agents in black robes whose augmetic eyes never blinked. They brushed the crowd as though measuring pulses, marking faces, tracing secrets in the curl of a lip or the tremor of a hand. None of us heard his name, but names were unnecessary. His word was the Emperor's word. And when his voice spoke, it was like steel drawn from its scabbard. Calm, inevitable, lethal. One man was named aloud, a manufactorum overseer, plucked from the crowd without ceremony. His eyes widened, mouth opening to protest. But there was no protest. The agents closed around him, and in the next breath he was gone. No blood spilled, no public spectacle. His name erased as though it had never existed. That was the Inquisition's true terror. Death was a mercy, an ending. Erasure was a sentence without end, a void where memory itself was outlawed. But what chilled us most was not who was taken, but who was left behind. The Inquisition never needed proof. A rumor was enough, a doubt was enough. And even when the guilty were culled, the purges began anew. Every silence was suspect, every breath measured, until loyalty itself became indistinguishable from absence. To remain alive was not survival. It was the slow, gnawing recognition that your existence could only persist at the mercy of an unseen will. I began to understand then that betrayal, whether whispered in a hab-block corridor or invented by a fearful neighbor, was never the conclusion. It was a spark, one that fed a fire which consumed everything in its path. The purge spread not to punish the guilty, but to cleanse the idea that guilt could ever end. And when he finally spoke the words that sealed the world's fate, there was no thunder, no roar of rage. His voice was level, almost soft, but it carried with it the weight of the Imperium's absolute certainty. Entire cities disappeared in that moment, not by bombardment, not by fire, but by decree. Their names struck from record, their history erased, their people reduced to footnotes in archives that no eye but the Inquisitions would ever see. The hive held its breath. Some wept, some prayed, some clutched their children closer as if flesh could shield them from judgment. But the Inquisitor did not falter. did not explain, did not waver. He was not rage. He was inevitability. And when the last word left his lips, we understood the most terrifying truth of all. Judgment in the Imperium was not forged in fury, but in certainty. The ruins no longer smoldered, yet the air still tasted of ash. Not the clean burn of promethium, but the acrid residue of names consumed. Histories made to vanish beneath fire sanctioned by decree. In the Hivespire's plaza, banners once lifted, high in triumph, were reduced to curling threads of soot, drifting on the stagnant wind. Families gathered where their crests had once hung, staring at blank walls where symbols of loyalty had been scorched away. To the Arbites and ecclesiarchy priests who watched, this was not destruction, it was purification. To those stripped of legacy, it was silence sharper than any blade. A decree from Terra had come days before, cold and unadorned, its words carved into the vox grills of every hab block. Entire lineages excised from the archives, their names erased not only from the annals of war, but from memory itself. Once, these families had spoken with pride of their dead who served in the Astra Militarum, their sons and daughters who had bled across the stars for the Imperium's endless wars. Now those same names were forbidden, consigned to the dust of sealed vaults beneath Administratum strongholds. To speak them aloud was no longer remembrance. It was heresy. I remember walking through the Manufactorum quarter, where the once proud 19th Varen Regiment had been raised. There were no statues now, no lists of the fallen etched into bronze plates, no shrine plaques mounted in memory. The regimental crest had been scraped from the walls, leaving only jagged scars across the rockcrete. The workers moved as though, under a pall, servitors lumbering without pause, their vox emitters droning the same litany again and again. The Emperor is eternal. The Emperor does not forget. The Emperor demands silence. But it was not the Emperor's silence they feared. It was the Inquisition's. Even the children carried the mark of erasure. Their school names were stripped from records, their bloodlines recorded as suspect until proven pure. I saw a boy no older than 7 weep in the shadows of a hab corridor, clutching a rag that bore the torn half of a family crest, its colors smeared into nothing. His mother tore it from his hands, her face pale with terror, whispering that to hold on to the past was to invite damnation. In that moment I wondered, what was worse, to lose one's kin to war, or to watch them erased until their sacrifice became forbidden breath? The silence grew heavier with each passing day. It was not only spoken silence, but the absence of litanies half recited, vox transmissions cut short, archives with pages missing. In the great cathedral of the spire, the priests avoided certain verses, letting their chants falter into empty pauses where names of honored martyrs should have been sung. The congregation knew the words that should follow, but none dared speak them. Even the incense seemed to burn weaker, its smoke thinning as if afraid to linger, and yet, silence has weight. The more it pressed upon us, the more it echoed. People spoke with their eyes when their mouths dared not move. A glance lingered too. Long upon an empty shrine, a hand paused on a blank seal, and in that hesitation was an entire rebellion unspoken. We carried it not as sound but as memory, and memory itself became dangerous. At the heart of the plaza, a new shrine was raised, not of triumph, not of devotion, but of apology. Its stone was plain, its candles few, its offerings meager. There was no aquila spread in triumph upon it, only a carved admonition. Purity through silence. People came not to pray, but to lower their heads in shame. The wax dripped slowly down the altar's edges, its flame a guttering light that seemed ashamed to burn beneath the Emperor's gaze. Some whispered that to kneel there was to confess loyalty through fear, not faith. Others swore it was worse, that it was not devotion at all, but the act of a world trying to erase itself before the Inquisition erased it entirely. And so the hive grew quieter, but the quiet did not soothe. It screamed. It screamed in the gaps, between hymns in the erased lines of a child's lesson book, in the void carved where names once stood proud. It screamed so loud that even those who claimed to hear nothing began to tremble. Because silence, when demanded, is no silence at all. It is a wound. The shrine's candles flickered low, their flames dancing like whispers that would not die, casting shadows across the Emperor's carved face. None dared look too long, yet none could look away. The weight of the past pressed down harder than any Arbeits patrol, heavier than the ash that still coated the manufactorum floors. Names erased from the archives did not stay buried. They surfaced, in whispers, in the stuttered prayers of hive gangs, in the wary glances of Skitarii sentries, whose augmetic eyes scanned for inherited guilt as surely as they scanned for traitors on the battlefield. One could feel it in every corner of the hive, the unspoken inheritance of sin, carried not by those who had faltered, but by the blood they left behind. Generations bowed beneath it, bending beneath chains not of steel, but of memory, promethium-stained and unyielding. I watched the overseer's grandson shuffle past the ruins of his family's former manufactorum, hands stained with soot and oil, the sharp tang of metal and chemical lingering in the air like a curse. He did not dare meet the eyes of the ecclesiarchy, priest who paced the square, his censers swinging and incense drifting into the boy's hair, because he knew that even obedience could not cleanse the record etched deep into his bloodline. Each step he took carried the weight of a crime committed long before his birth, a fault that the Imperium refused to forgive, a shame that could not be expunged. In the lower hab blocks, children whispered forbidden prayers in the shadows of collapsed walkways. They invoked the Emperor not as protector, but as judge, voice trembling, syllables twisted by fear of inherited disgrace. Their words were raw, jagged with emotion, and yet disciplined by terror, prayers that sought mercy for sins they had not committed, for names erased before they were even born. The shadows around them seemed to lean closer, as though listening, and I wondered if the Inquisition had ways of marking guilt across the generations, unseen, yet absolute. Even the loyal faltered under the weight. Skitarii legions, precise and unwavering in their duty, hesitated at the sight of regiments bearing tainted lineage. Units whose forebears had been purged in the Ordo Hereticus sweeps were met with silent suspicion, their banners ignored, their histories doubted. Trust was a currency they could not afford, and hesitation was a fault as damning as rebellion itself. In the grand cathedrals, the ecclesiarchy reminded the faithful that the Emperor remembers all debts, that no sin, spoken or inherited, escapes his gaze. The sermons carried a quiet, crushing inevitability. You are the sum of your bloodline, and the past is never dead. I found myself walking through the lower manufactorum corridors, inhaling the bitter tang of burnt oil, the grit of ash grinding between my teeth, listening to the distant hum of servitors working under orders that never questioned lineage. Each cog in the machinery, each hiss of steam, felt like a footfall on the backs of ancestors long dead. Labor was no longer just survival, it was penance. Every spark that arced across the forge carried the unspoken accusation of forebearly guilt. The overseer's descendants bent beneath this weight as if gravity had doubled, and each drop of sweat was a confession written in flesh. And still, the hive carried on, silent, watching, remembering. Every street corner, every hab-block corridor was a monument to past errors, invisible yet undeniable. Loyalty was enforced not by punishment alone, but by the constant gnawing certainty that the sins of others were now yours to bear. Whispered heresies became impossible to distinguish from prayer. A glance too long, a hesitation too sharp, and a lifetime could be condemned. The child appeared in the plaza, small and trembling, a data slate clutched in his hands. His tears fell upon its smooth surface, smearing the name etched there, one already purged from the records of Terra. The letters blurred beneath the heat of his grief, a symbol of sins long erased yet living in the marrow of blood. He whispered, voice so soft it might have been the wind itself, asking a God who had already judged generations before him for forgiveness he might never receive. Around him the world carried on, oblivious to his supplication, yet every shadow seemed to lean in, as if listening to the weight of a sin that would never die. Even in silence, the past demanded reckoning. Even in obedience, the curse of memory endured. And somewhere, high above the spires, promethium smoke drifting into the thin sunlight, I understood that betrayal is never just a moment. It is a scar written across time, shaping lives that may never know the name of the sin that began it. The planet lay under a pall of muted light, the sun, or what passed for it through the dense industrial haze, casting long shadows over streets that had once thrummed with life. Now the hab blocks were silent, windows dark, shutters clamped shut against a world that had already turned away. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir here, carrying only the bitter tang of promethium dust and ash. It was not war that had brought this ruin, nor orc raids, nor Necron awakening. It was something quieter, more insidious. Betrayal had seeped into the marrow of this world, and the Imperium's judgment had etched itself into stone and bone alike. The cathedrals, once soaring with the sound of litanies and organ pipes, were empty shells, their doors locked, their altars coated in thick layers of dust. Incense hung stagnant in the air, its scent dulled to nothing more than a memory of holiness. I walked along the cracked stone floors of one such cathedral, my boots echoing where once a choir had filled the nave. The statues of saints and martyrs were worn, eyes chipped and faces blurred by centuries of neglect, yet in their form lingered a reproach as sharp as a last shot. It felt as though the Emperor himself had turned his gaze away, leaving the faithful to tremble beneath shadows that whispered of sins long past. The manufactura fared no better. Gigantic forges, once alive with the hiss of steam, the grinding of cogs and the roar of plasma torches, now stood silent. Servitors rusted in place, their joints seized, vox emitters cracked, cables dangling like lifeless veins. The smell of oil and molten metal had been replaced by the stench of stagnation and decay. Workers, once proud to craft the engines of war, had fled or been purged, leaving only ghosts behind. Memories of labor etched into walls and machinery, the weight of forgotten duty pressing down like lead. Even the promethium still burning in distant refineries seemed to cough in protest, its flames meager and choked. Pilgrims who once came seeking solace avoided this world now, their ships detouring as though superstition had taken the place of navigation. Some claimed the soil itself rejected the seed, that crops would wither before touch, and that the Astronomican's light above dimmed in response to unseen transgressions. Others whispered that this was only the fear of mortals magnified by rumor, yet the effect was no less real. Entire populations had learned to walk quietly, to avoid drawing attention to themselves, and to speak only in muted tones lest their very words invoke the judgment of the Emperor or the Inquisition. Inhabitants, those who remained, moved with a mechanical rhythm, prayers recited not with devotion but with desperate, hollowed fear. Faith was no longer a burning beacon here. It was a trembling, fragile ember, kept alive only because silence and repetition were easier than death. Each hymn became a plea, each candle an apology, each bowed head a confession. Parents whispered their own shame to children, who could not understand the weight they carried. And the children, in turn, learned early that to hope was dangerous, that the past's sins could reach forward through time to crush the unwary. Above it all, the planet's ruined skyline shimmered under the dim glow of distant stars. The Astronomican's light, whether dimmed or imagined so by fear, seemed to hover hesitantly, as though uncertain whether this world deserved its guidance. The void around it stretched silent and indifferent, holding the planet in a suspended judgment that had no end. Every tower, every desolate plaza, every abandoned forge whispered the same lesson. Betrayal leaves no bodies to mourn, only echoes that twist belief itself, spreading like a slow, inexorable rot through generations. And in that silence, standing on a ridge overlooking the decayed spires, I realized that ruin here was not measured in walls or blood. It was measured in hope extinguished, in faith reduced to ritual, in the weight of unspoken terror that pressed down upon every life. Even when voices were stilled, even when the dust settled, the echoes of betrayal hummed through the planet's bones, waiting to be heard again, to remind any who dared to remember that sin, once committed or once inherited, never truly dies. The distant fires of promethium refineries flickered weakly in the haze, their glow barely reaching the shattered streets below, as if the planet itself shivered under the burden of memory. In the hollow quiet, it was easy to imagine that the world itself mourned, whispering its own apology to a God who may never forgive. The corridors of the custode's sanctum smelled of polished stone and incense, a mixture meant to impress and to intimid. Yet even here the scent could not mask the unease that crept like a shadow through the vaulted halls. The gold-clad warriors moved with silent precision, their eyes ever vigilant. Yet behind the discipline, even they could not ignore the murmurs threading through the stone corridors. Rumors whispered from one chamber to another, carried on voices so soft they could have been mistaken for the hum of the walls themselves. Some spoke of the Astronomican flickering in ways that no mortal instrument could record, of starlight bending and shivering as if resisting the guiding hands of Terra. Each story, repeated in hushed tones, layered the sanctum with tension, leaving every custodes aware that the weight of vigilance could stretch beyond the corporeal, into the very soul of the Imperium. Navigators in crystal spheres, their eyes opaque with unearthly focus, shivered as currents of warp light shifted around them. The patterns of star streaks, normally steady and predictable, now trembled as though recoiling from unseen fractures in human devotion. One spoke quietly to another, voice trembling, describing a feeling of currents lost in shadow, of pathways across the void dimming under the weight of betrayal. The words were cautious, never intended for ears beyond the chamber, yet even whispered they carried the gravity of cosmic consequence. Was this the faltering of the Astronomicon, or merely the fear of mortals interpreting a normal fluctuation as omen? The question lingered, unanswerable, feeding the quiet terror in the marrow of those sworn to protect the Emperor's light. Ecclesiarchs conducted rites in hidden cloisters, their censers swinging heavy with incense, the fragrant smoke curling in slow spirals through candlelight. Their prayers were half song, half warning, syllables sharp with the authority of divine judgment. They murmured of vigilance and piety, of hearts turned away from the Emperor and the stars that suffer for every act of treachery. The faithful who witnessed these secret rituals felt both awe and dread. Devotion became intertwined with fear. Even those whose loyalty was unquestioned felt the gnawing unease that a single failure, a single lapse might ripple outward and touch the very currents that guided their fleets, their legions, their lives. From the far reaches of the sanctum came the thin, keening wail of an astropath, his voice carried across the void by the faint hum of the Imperium's psychic channels. The sound was haunting, neither fully message nor song, a fragment of warning broken by distance and interference. Those who heard it felt the vibration in their bones, the warning that some truths were too dangerous to articulate, that some acts of faith or betrayal resonated beyond comprehension. Even the custodes paused, statuesque in their golden armor, feeling the gravity of an unseen truth pressing against them. It was a reminder that judgment did not end at the material world, that betrayal could fracture more than flesh, that silence itself might become a danger if left unchecked. The sanctum, usually a place of absolute order, now felt fragile. Gold and marble could not contain the tremor of cosmic uncertainty. Whispers carried warnings but also fear, and the boundaries between rumor and revelation blurred. Each step taken through the echoing halls was a step through potential disaster, a navigation of consequences that extended beyond sight or sound, reaching into the currents of human will and divine expectation alike. The fear of what could not be seen, of the Astronomicon faltering, of light dimming across the Imperium, settled like dust on every surface, coating the minds of those sworn to vigilance with the weight of infinite responsibility. At the highest observation deck, overlooking Terra and the faint glow of the Astronomicon on the horizon, a lone custodian paused. The stars above shimmered, steady yet strange, as if acknowledging the whispers that threaded through the hidden sanctums below. Somewhere across the void, a vessel carrying pilgrims, psychers, and navigators trembled in response to currents they could not name. The Imperium held its breath, and in that quiet, fragile pause it became clear, the consequences of betrayal are not measured only in ash or blood. They echo outward, twisting through faith, starlight, and the unspoken terror of the vigilant. A distant, wailing voice of an astropath carried faintly across the void once more, broken and trembling, a single note of warning that could not be ignored. It was not a call to arms, nor a declaration of victory. It was a signal of fragility, a whisper of the impermanence of certainty, and a promise that some truths would only be known when it was too late. The golden light of the custodes' halls shimmered off polished marble and armored breastplates, yet it could not dispel the weight that hung in every corridor. Even here, in the heart of Terra, where vigilance was law and faith absolute, whispers crept like smoke through the vaulted ceilings. They spoke of those who had faltered, not merely in body or action but in essence, lives erased so completely that no record, no memory, not even in the warp could recall them. It was a fear that stretched across the Imperium, subtle yet unrelenting, that betrayal might unmake a soul entirely, leaving nothing for the Astronomicon to guide, nothing for prayer to touch, and no record to haunt or warn. Navigators in their crystal spheres recoiled from these murmurs, feeling currents of starlight warp in response to unseen absences. Their eyes, pale and opaque, reflected the trembling of a galaxy too vast for mortal comprehension. The silence of erased worlds hummed in their minds as if the void itself remembered, carrying a weight no compass or datum could quantify. One spoke cautiously, voice low and trembling, asking whether it was merely fear speaking, or a truth so terrible it could unseat even the certainty of the Emperor's dominion. Around them, the sanctum seemed to lean closer, listening, as if the walls themselves had learned to anticipate human doubt. In the shadowed halls, Adeptus Custodes paused, statuesque even in hesitation. Their steps, usually echoing with authority, softened in awareness that perfection, even theirs, was no shield against erasure. They moved through corridors gilded and immaculate, yet pregnant with the unspoken terror that a single misstep, a failure to observe, could erase a life not just from history, but from existence. The vastness of Terra's architecture became a mirror to the fragility of the individual, a stark contrast between the grandeur of the Imperium and the tenuous thread by which one clung to memory. In the heart of devotion, awe and dread mingled. The very act of witnessing became a reminder that life, loyalty, and remembrance were inseparable. Even the voice of the ecclesiarchy, carried through secretive liturgies, betrayed the unease. Priests muttered in half-songs, syllables taught with fear and reverence, warning that the Emperor's light saw all, even what mortals could not perceive. Their censers swung slow, smoke curling in elaborate spirals, filling chapels with the scent of burning resin and sacred incense. Each flicker of candlelight illuminated faces drawn tight with anxiety, eyes darting toward unseen corners where shadows seemed too dense, too knowing. Worship was no longer reassurance. It became a fragile shield, a prayer cast not with hope but with the quiet terror of being unmade. Across the galaxy, the Voxnet pulsed with disquiet. Messages that never fully formed carried the residue of erasure, stations reporting nothing, worlds uncounted, populations absent without record. Each silence was more than a pause. It was an absence that reverberated, a reminder that existence could be rescinded entirely. Pilgrims and planetary governors alike whispered of planets that had vanished from registers, their names struck from memory, their histories folded into nothing. No monument remained, no record, not even a shred in the archives of Terra. And yet, in the absence, the echo of lives once lived lingered faintly, a ghostly pulse felt by those attuned enough to perceive it. The narrative closes on a lonely, flickering vox beacon, spinning its faint signal in a void that refuses to answer. It is the sole remnant of a civilization erased, a whisper cast across the darkness, hinting at the cosmic inevitability of oblivion. Even Adeptus Custodes, standing sentinel in golden halls, cannot ignore it. The light dances across their visors, reflecting not triumph or clarity, but the fragile, trembling edge of existence itself. And as the beacon spins silently, one question hangs heavier than any command or decree. In a universe so vast, so governed by the will of the Emperor, can a life truly endure if the Imperium chooses to forget? The corridors of the Adeptus Custodes' sanctum were quieter than usual, yet the silence carried a weight that pressed on the mind as much as the body. Even in gold-clad perfection, the Custodes felt it, the void left behind when a life was excised from memory, a void that seemed to ripple across Terra itself. Navigators spoke in hushed tones, their crystal spheres clouded with visions they could neither name nor fully understand, showing currents of starlight dimmed by absence, as though the very galaxy mourned what had been unmade. In these moments, the difference between death and erasure blurred. A fallen soldier might still echo in remembrance, but the vanished were gone, untouchable, their existence denied by every ledger, every register, every litany. In the chambers of the ecclesiarchy, priests paused mid-prayer, eyes staring at nothing, fingers tight around rosaries, scent of incense thick and choking. The murmur of forgotten names twisted into a liturgy of terror, a devotion that trembled beneath the notion that the Emperor might no longer acknowledge some lives. Even among the faithful, uncertainty festered. If the Astronomicon could sense the souls of the loyal, could it also perceive the absence of those obliterated? Some whispered that erasure was a punishment beyond mortal comprehension, a sentence that no confession, no atonement, could counteract. The sound of a censer swinging became a heartbeat of unease, smoke curling into spirals that resembled nothing so much as fading lives. Across the Imperium, the effect was tangible. Vox relays, normally buzzing with reports and prayers, occasionally fell silent, and rumor claimed that entire planetary populations could vanish from record overnight. Data slates in manufacturum offices showed blanks where once there had been logs. Registers in the archives of Terra displayed gaps that clerks refused to explain. Pilgrims spoke of worlds with empty streets, of cities where echoes answered for the missing. Even the Scutari, programmed for absolute loyalty and efficiency, moved cautiously near sectors where memory had been purged, sensors attuned not to life but to absence itself. It was as though the galaxy had learned to remember not only what was, but what must never have been. The effect on those who remained was subtle, corrosive, impossible to measure by any standard except intuition and dread. Officials checked names twice, then thrice, voices tightening as they called the roll. Soldiers hesitated before orders, aware that hesitation could be deadly, yet also aware that even obedience could not guarantee permanence. Faith was not enough. It was a fragile armor against a terror whose shape was the erasure of one's own narrative. To exist in the Imperium was no longer merely to breathe or to serve. It was to be inscribed in memory, to endure in registers, to survive the gaze of the Emperor and the scrutiny of the Astronomicon. And to fail in any of these was to invite a silence that might extend beyond death. The chapter narrows to a single, impossible focus, the flickering of the Astronomicon itself, casting a light both radiant and fragile across the void. It shivered in intensity, a pulse that seemed almost aware, responding to the absence of one nameless soul whose existence had been scrubbed clean from every record. Was it grief, warning, or merely the perception of the imperceptible? Those who observed it did not know, yet each understood the implication. Betrayal's cost was not measured solely in blood or ash, but in the profound obliteration of being. The stars themselves seemed to shiver in recognition, a cosmic acknowledgement of lives denied even the right to memory. And as the light pulsed once more, steadying, the silence fell, thick and unbroken, pressing in from Terra to the outermost rim. No whisper, no prayer, no echo remained to fill it. Only the weight of absence, a reminder that the universe itself could witness the void left behind. The custodes, the ecclesiarchs, the navigators, all stood beneath that impossible flickering beacon, and each felt the same truth, that existence in the Imperium was contingent, fragile, and that even remembrance could fail. The chapter closes on that flicker, lingering longer than reason allows, leaving a question unspoken but heavy. Can one truly exist if the Imperium refuses to remember?